Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. This has been a rather varied journey through certain interesting biographical stories taken from the enormous length and breadth historically and geographically of the Ummah, and that's part of the point, I suppose, to indicate that those who follow the prophetic excellence have their own coordinates in space and time and implement that excellence in ways that are proper to that particular location. This is kind of obvious. What I want to do today is to look at somebody who is a leader in a very distinctive context, which is that of the Ottoman bureaucracy. Now, a couple of months ago, we looked at the figure of Shaykh Abdal Hakim, who was, as we saw for a while, the Mufti of Damascus, which was an official Ottoman appointment, but who by and large shunned the company of officials. Even more so in our previous lecture, the one we did in Ramadan on Nizamuddin Awliya, the great saint of Muslim Delhi, who had two doors in his house, as you'll recall, one that he'd normally use and one that he'd use to leave if any state official should pay him a visit. This is particularly the custom of the Sufis in Islamic history, who prefer to take the side of the population, and particularly the poor, against the inevitable depredations of imperial bureaucracies and civil services. Not so easy a luxury, however, for those who work in the judiciary. And Islam, as a legal tradition, necessarily wishes to shape not just the content, but also the conduct and the procedural matrix of the law. In some contexts, such as that of, say, 18th century West Africa, Hausaland, that was administered in a very elemental, primordial, spontaneous, unbureaucratized way. The lack of complexity in what was still partly a nomadic society enabled that. But in the context of North India, under the great Mughals, with their state bureaucracy and their propensity for sharia elaborations and the publication of fatwa collections, and also in the context of other imperial realities such as the Ottoman Empire, the procedures of the judiciary and the ways in which the sharia, apparently in its point of origin, emanating from so different a cultural and an administrative context, became a matter of intense and inevitable concern by jurists. They couldn't, like many of the Sufis, just leave by a back door. It was their responsibility to step up and to ensure, as far as they could, the ethical and sharia-compliant application of the structures of enormous creaking imperial bureaucracies. And in the Ottoman Empire, this was perhaps the largest of them all. If you venture into the mouldering corridors of the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, you will see that so much was retained, maybe 110 million different files and documents. It's said to be the world's largest collection of pre-modern archives anywhere. Every last thing was kept there, not just in duplicate in the provinces. Sometimes they survived, sometimes they didn't, but many of them, particularly from the mid-15th century onwards, in the crabbed, Persianate, civil service, almost illegible handwriting of a big imperial bureaucracy at the Sublime Porte, Bab Ali. It was a bureaucratic state and needed to be, because of its size and complexity, and the fact that as the early modern period dawned, the Ottoman Empire was part of a global world of trade, the exchange of technologies and information, and simplicity was not an option. The longevity of the Ottoman state, the reasons for it, continue to furrow our brows. Why is it that the British Empire lasted maybe for 90 years in its kind of established form? The Ottoman Empire lasted maybe for 600 years. Still just about a living memory for a few real old-timers in a few Balkan and Anatolian places into our age, but it emerged in the 13th century, which is not bad for a single family. No ancient Egyptian dynasty, father to son, lasted that long. So the stability of this sharia-centered state and its evident difference from the original prophetic model, the huge size of it, the variation of languages and cultures, the existence of things like gunpowder, the necessity to maintain a huge navy. These were things that are not part of the original seerah matrix for the generation of the sharia and required the careful exercise of ijtihad. So what I want to look at today is to see how one of our Muslim personalities, not necessarily one without flaws, existed in the context of that enormous Constantinople civil service and was able to effect change despite the enormous kind of inertia that tends to affect any large institution. And to see if we can offer some remarks about how Islam was constitutionally figured at the eve of modernity. What was the interpretation and the structures of Islam that were inherited by the Muslims as modernity starts to impact, firstly through the advent of new military technologies, then the printing press, and then the need to embark in permanent treaty and trading relationships with the concert of Europe. The Ottomans were the ones who had to deal with those questions before anyone else did, simply because of their geography. They were a European state. The most prestigious core provinces of the Ottoman Empire were taken to be the European provinces. Istanbul was a European city. The previous capital, Edirne, had been a European city. They saw themselves as Rumelians, and then there was Anatolia, the other side of the Bosphorus, and then after the early 16th century, the Arab provinces were added, but we need to remember that the center of gravity for Caliphal Islam was taken to be the European provinces, Macedonia, Albania, Bosnia, Hungary. These were the heartlands of Caliphal Islam. So let's see if we can use this biography as an opportunity to offer some reflections on how that works and to see the extent to which classical, in this case Hanafi, essentially 11th, 12th century Khurasani, Samarkandian interpretations of the Hanafi tradition successfully underpinned the stability and the might of that polity, and the extent also to which it turned out not to be practical and in need of either utilitarian or systematic ijtihad-based transformations. So let's start to think about that. How does the sharia, and this seems to be in many ways the problem of modern Islamic politics, which emerges in so specific a space and time in 7th century Arabia, and which takes itself to be revealed law and therefore in principle not open to change, become the successful legal, jurisprudential, constitutional foundation and fabric for a gunpowder empire almost 1,000 years later, let alone our modern world of big data and globalization. So, some contemporary lessons here perhaps. But the person I want to talk about specifically, who is really the paradigmatic Ottoman alim, not just in terms of the legal and the spiritual culture which he occupied, but the fact that he is in the golden age. He's the great scholar of the 16th century. This is the age of Suleiman the Magnificent and Istanbul as the jewel of the world. But also because in many ways he understands the tension that exists between local imperial pragmatism and the idealizing discourse of the sharia, and is, in the Turkish memory at any rate, regarded as the one who tries to bring customary law, sultanic decree, together with the ideals of the the Hanafi sharia. So we'll see the extent to which that is needed and the ways that he found in order to bring together that, in many ways, difficult convergence. So this is Ebussuud, Ebussuud, as the Turks say, generally regarded as the greatest of the Ottoman scholars, which had begun really with Dawudi Qaysari at the time of the first Ottoman capital in Iznik in the 13th century, and ends with Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri in the early 20th century, and the abolition of the position of Shaykh al-Islam. Maybe a bigger sort of constitutional earthquake for the Muslims even than the abolition of the caliphate, because the caliphate in many ways, as we will see, is a kind of symbolic figure with very few executive and religious functions, whereas the Shaykh al-Islam was 100 years ago. Everybody would think about what was the Shaykh al-Islam's view on a particular topic. And if you go to Suleiman's great mosque, which, as we'll see, was really created in partnership with Ebussuud, next to the mosque is an empty space, which is where the office of the Shaykh al-Islam was located. If you were a British Muslim in the 19th century, you wanted to go on Hajj, and you were called Toby or something, the way to get there would be to apply to the office of the Shaykh al-Islam. Not an Islamic papacy, but certainly unanimously accepted amongst Sunni Muslims as the highest source of fatwa. So again, we'll be thinking about what is this legal system that has fatwas that are not kind of executive decisions, but are kind of consultative, authoritative statements. How does that fit? So Ataturk had the building demolished, of course, and the last Shaykh al-Islam was chased into exile, and that kind of empty space is sort of symbolic of something that has caused many of the decentralizing, vociferous instabilities of the Muslim Ummah ever since, I guess, 1926. The post was abolished, and the Kemalists were dancing on the grave of the old Islamic constitutions. So, Ebussuud Effendi, a little bit of biodata, first of all. And the biodata in the Ottoman context comes from, in most cases, although you can learn things about the individuals by reading their works, and particularly their fatwas, sort of anecdotes by scholars of the day, but basically the sources we have for the ulama of the Ottoman Empire begin with a scholar called Tashkaprizadeh, who writes a book called Ash-Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya, which is something like The Purple Petals or something. They really like really flowery titles for their books, and the writing is quite extraordinarily baroque and florid as well, not an easy read. Tashkaprizadeh is one of the great scholars of the 16th century, puts together this work. He also writes a book, if you're familiar with Arabic literature, called Miftah al-Sa'ada, which is very generally used. It's in Arabic, which is a list of all of the great sciences of Islam and those that are practiced, not just sort of tafsir and hadith, but also geometry. What are the main books on geometry? And finding the Qibla and all of these smaller sciences, hundreds of them, as it turns out. Tashkaprizadeh, an important scholar of the Ottoman realm, and he organizes his book, Ash-Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya, not according to the dates of the scholars, but inconveniently according to the reign of the Sultan in which each of the scholars happened to die. So it takes a bit of navigating. Tashkaprizadeh doesn't include a notice on Ebussuud Effendi because he's just too early. So the main information that we have for his life comes from his successor, who is called Nawizadeh Ata'i Effendi, who is also from Istanbul, but spends much of his career in Üsküp, which is present-day Skopje, which is one of the great cities for the ulama and for judgeship, now the capital of whatever they call it nowadays, Northern Macedonia, but still has some major Ottoman structures there. It's certainly a city worth visiting, and it still has a Mufti and a Mufti's office, but of course part of the national structure of Macedonia, sadly diminished. But Muslims are 40% of the population of Macedonia. They survived the 20th century massacres, and It's still alive as a Muslim place, but many of the great ulama of the Ottoman Empire would, as part of the very complex, almost ritualized process of career progression, spend some time in the great city of Üsküp. So Altai is in Üsküp, and partly during that time he writes his own book, which is a continuation of Tashkent-Rizade's book, which he calls Hada'iq al-Haqa'iq, the Meadows of Truths, which follows the form of Mejdi's translation of Tashkent-Rizade's book. So it goes into Turkish, and the same old annoying format. You have to know the death dates of the Sultan and when the scholar died before you can find the notice. It's not alphabetical, but these books were so widely used by the scholars that it was easy, if you were familiar with the tradition, to navigate. So we have, of course, as you would expect, all of these books in the CMC library. And here is his notice. We won't read all of it, with all of its kind of pulling out the organ stops of Baroque 16th century prose. But here we are. Al-Mulla al-A'zam Ebussuud al-Imadi. Al-Imadi is what they call him, but we don't really know where this Imad comes from. They don't explain that. Huwa ad-din wa ad-dunya. So here he goes, trumpet blasts. هو اللفظ والمعنى هو الغاية القصوى هو الذروة العليا سلطان المفسرين مقدمي جيش المتأخرين مفتي الأنام مفني البدع والآثام صاحب أذيال الإفضال والإسعاد صاحب الإرشاد ابن صاحب الإرشاد, blah blah, and then you get some complicated poetry. So it begins with this fanfare. He is religion and the world. He is the expression and the meaning of the expression. He is the utmost limit. He is the highest peak, the sultan of the commentators, the vanguard of the army of the later scholars, the mufti of all nations, the destroyer of innovations and sins, the one whose robe majestically trails the train of generosity and felicity. You get the idea. This is very elaborate Baroque prose. And he is Abu Hanifi Sani. He is the second Abu Hanifa. And this is what the Ottomans like to call him, because he's rising above the parochialism and the pessimism about what the later scholars are able to accomplish in Islamic history. There's this kind of fatalism about decline. But at the same time, we, the Ottomans, have produced another Abu Hanifa. Ottomans, of course, are overwhelmingly the heirs to the Hanafi tradition. Hanafi tradition really has as its heartlands, particularly in kind of the formulation of the earliest texts, its heartlands in Central Asia, Khorasan, the Turkic-speaking places, Turkic, Farsi-speaking, Samarkand in particular. That's where Burhanuddin Marghinani, who becomes one of the great authorities for Ottoman fiqh, is buried very close to Imam Maturidi, who is really the founder of the Maturidi tradition of Hanafi, quasi-rationalizing theology that becomes the official doctrine, really, of the Ottoman state. So the intellectual flow into the Ottoman Empire is not from the south, from the Arab world, but from the east. And there's historical migratory reasons for that. How do the Turks come to be in Anatolia and even the Balkans when they originate far to the east, almost in Mongolia? Because the Mongols are pushing them west. Remember how Rumi leaves Balkh and ends up in Konya? They're refugees. Similarly, the Turks are migrating to the west, particularly the scholars. Nomads have been leaving for a long time, and working as kind of bodyguards and henchmen and heavies, and that's how they come to dominate the Abbasid Caliphate, and even in the time of Ghazali. These are the Seljuks. But the Ottomans are the inheritors of this east to west migratory flow from places like Kashgar, Samarkand, Shesh, which is now Tashkent, Bukhara. Those are their roots. They look to the east, and so overwhelming, it's a Hanafi Maturidi tradition. And in Abu Sa'ud's fatwas and legal compendias, we don't really see much reference to the other madhahib, even though by his time the Arab world, the Shafi'i world of Syria, Palestine, is part of the imperial reality. And Sultan Suleiman even adds North Africa. Algiers becomes an Ottoman city, which is Maliki, but it's a Hanafi state. So he's Abu Hanifa II. Now, we get the biodata then from Ottoman Effendi. The most distinguished contemporary presentation is Colin Imber, formerly of Manchester University, Ebussuud, the Islamic legal tradition, which is really first-rate and actually quite accessible explanation, not just of his life and times, but also of the intellectual challenges which he faced as somebody who, centuries after the incipience of the sharia in Mecca and Medina in the 7th century, is seeing how it can still work in a credible, justifiable way in the context of this post-Byzantine imperial structure. So I'm going to be following Colin's book pretty closely during the course of this journey. So basic biodata, we don't quite know when he was born, somewhere around 1490. And his early life is Anatolian, not Rumelian. Rumelia is basically the Balkan provinces of the empire. Rumeli, obsolete term now. Rumelian is the academic world. Family is from a rather minor place called Iskilip, which is kind of north-central Anatolia. His father was somebody called Muhyiddin Effendi, who was a pupil of a very distinguished scholar called Ali Kushju, who is one of these Samarkand kind of refugees, migrants, fortune seekers who come to the new imperial courts of the West from the East. Ali Kushju is a famous astronomer and helps to get astronomy going in Felek amongst the Ottomans, but also a significant interpreter of Arabic philosophy and theology. During the reign of Mehmed II, one of the things that the new ruler had wanted to do was to establish the kind of sacked city of Constantinople as an intellectual centre. So he would invite in scholars and promote debates. And one of the big debates was was about the effectiveness of Imam al-Ghazali's refutation of Ibn Sina, the famous Tahafut al-Falasifa. It's one of the summit moments of Islamic metaphysics. And the Sultan recognized this. These are highly educated men. Sultan Mehmed, master of different languages, wrote poetry, cultivated man who wanted these debates to be worked out. What is the correct relationship between reason, revelation, ilm al-kalam, falsafa? He was interested, so he commissions this big debate. And some of the heavy guns include people like Khojazadeh, who is the Muslahiddin Khojazadeh, who is the chief qadi of Bursa, which again is like Üsküp, one of these key imperial appointments, and who writes a book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, in which he revisits Ghazali's challenge to Ibn Sina. Ali Kushju is writing more from a kind of Abyssinian perspective. And then Kemal Pasha-Zadeh, who is really the first great Ottoman Shaykh al-Islam, this line of Shaykh al-Islams that we had until 1920-something, writes a commentary on Khojazadeh's work, and that becomes, Islamic intellectual history in Istanbul gets off to a bang with that very interesting dialogue of the different tahafuts. So Ali Kushju is like the great uncle of Ebussuud Effendi, and that strong emphasis on the kind of philosophical rationalizing approach leaves its mark on him. His first teacher is somebody called Muayyad Zadeh, who is based in Amasya. This is a kind of nice central Anatolian town, which is politically important because it was the custom of the Ottoman sultans to get rid of their kind of annoying teenage sons and send them off as governors of certain cities, which would be cities with a kind of royal mosque and a palace. So it was comfortable, but also useful training for the time when they would or at least one of them would end up being successor to the Ottoman Sultanate. So Amasya is an important place to be, and much, as we'll see, of the Ottoman system depends on patronage. How do you get to be a Qadi or a Grand Vizier or a Grand Admiral or whatever? It was meritocratic to some extent, and they didn't have, unlike England at the time, anything like a hereditary aristocracy. This is important to understand because we think of the Ottoman Empire as being kind of feudal, based on a peasantry and tax farmers, but the Ottoman system, because it was based on the Islamic law of inheritance, didn't really have the kind of inherited aristocracy that comes from having a law of primogeniture. When the lord of the manor dies, his estate, whether he likes it or not, is divided up equally, or according to sharia principles, between his sons, and the daughters get something and the widows get something, and that's something that he cannot do anything about. So these big estates get broken up inevitably over time. So one of the features of Islamic civilization is that big sort of families of dukes, barons and so forth that you get in sort of English, Western history generally, certainly in the Byzantine context, doesn't really exist in the Islamic context, where the Sultan, when somebody dies, will just appoint somebody else who's maybe helped him to win a battle or written a nice book, will appoint him to be the new tax farmer for that particular region. So a different kind of system, but nonetheless these grants were in the royal gift. So it was meritocratic to some extent. If you won a battle, you could expect to be rewarded. The Romans had something quite similar to this, but you couldn't expect to pass it on to your eldest son, particularly if you're wealthy. You probably had several wives, slave girls. It was going to go to a lot of inheritors. It would be broken up. The Sultan would reclaim it, and somebody else who just won a battle or won the royal favour would be in your house the year after you die. So a different kind of constitutional arrangement that isn't really feudal. But at the same time, a system of patronage. How did you get these plum jobs, which are well-paid jobs, in the ulama hierarchy, what they call the ilmiya, or in the sort of, as it were, more secular branches of the civil service, tax collectors and the like. It was basically done through having friends in high places and through somehow getting into the charmed circle of the royal family. So being an Amasya was the first significant step for him because at the time, this is now the 1470s, the royal prince who is governing Amasya is Prince Bayezid, who actually ends up becoming Bayezid II, the Sultan, 1481 to 1512. Bayezid is a major scholar of Amasya. He's hanging out with the Sultan-to-be and introduces the, at this time very young, Ebussuud to the prince. And under Bayezid, when Bayezid becomes Sultan, this friendship bears fruit. So Bayezid rises to the hierarchy. And the hierarchy at the time meant that you were appointed first as a muderris to a fairly small college, and then to a larger college. And then you would become the Qadi, because a Qadi had to serve some time as an academic first if he was appointed to a major town. The Qadi of Mecca, the Qadi of Damascus, the Qadi of Sarajevo would be appointed from the ranks of people who'd really been teaching and researching. And then after being a Qadi for a while, you'd move up to more and more prestigious cities. So Bursa, Edirne, and then Istanbul were the plum sort of judgeships in the Ottoman Empire. And beyond that, there were three further positions. And these positions were called the two military judges, the Qadi al-Askar, Kazaskar, of Anatolia, and above that, the military judge of Rumelia, and then above that, in a complicated way, but not necessarily more powerful, but more prestigious and better paid, was the position of Shaykh al-Islam, which was basically giving fatwas. So these military judges emerged in the context of the early rapid expansion of the Ottoman Empire, in which normally a qadi is the qadi for a particular place, and hopefully he knows the place and usages of the place. And Islamic law is really quite responsive to local customs. But if you've got the army, and the Ottoman Empire had a big standing army, really the first proper standing army the world had seen since the decline of ancient Rome, not really a feudal levy, but they had a permanent army in the Janissaries. They could call upon landowners, of course, as part of the conditions of the sultanic grant of the land to perform military service, and woe betide them if they didn't turn up outside the sultan's standard on the day allocated for the beginning of some new march into Hungary or something. But there was a standing army as well, and these huge armies, 100,000 men or more, with all of their camp followers, like a moving city, couldn't be subject to local judges, but had to have their own judge. And because the Sultan was with the army, in most cases, this was like the whole state on the move. And because of the difficulties of logistics, it would take about 3 months to march from Istanbul to the frontiers in Europe, to the gates of Austria or Hungary, and it was like the capital itself moving. So to be the judge of that army was a hugely prestigious and important post that usually carried with it the benefits of associating with the Sultan, riding beside him, helping him to write his perhaps not very first-rate poetry as he kind of rode through these Serbian roads. And this was important. So the military judge of Anatolia, above that the military judge of Rumelia, and then you got to be the Shaykh al-Islam. So Mu'ayyid-Zadeh, having hung out with Prince Bayezid in Amasya, is rising very rapidly. Now, Ebussuud's father, this Muhyiddin Effendi, doesn't just have an uncle who is a kind of Avicennan philosopher, but also is very involved in the life of the tariqats, and is primarily known for this. So Bayezid, who seems to have had a great respect for him, brings him to Istanbul and gives him land and builds a tekke, a zawiya, a Sufi lodge for him, which becomes one of the places where members of the royal family, the imperial elite, heads of scribal offices in the palace, will go for blessings and to ask advice from the sheikh, from Ebussuud's father. So he seems to unite in himself these two worlds of the external and the internal, which is normal for ulama. It's the Ghazalian way. We saw with Abdul Ghani Nablusi how he teach fiqh in the morning, tasawwuf in the afternoon. Bringing together these two C's is part of what the major scholars do, and always is important for ijtihad. And this is regularly referred to by the authors of Usul al-Fiqh, because the jurist usually has to spend time finding kind of compromises in the messy world of real human situations. And there can be quite a few possible alternative judgments on any given issue. Particularly if you're a Mufti, there could be maybe half a dozen different possible fatwas that you can give in the context of a given legal situation. What is it that inclines the soul of the jurist to think that one view seems to be intuitively or humanly the better one rather than the other? To some extent it's subjective. It's the givenness of the Mufti in life, whether he's had an argument with his family, whatever. There are human issues at stake, and the ulama are very aware of this and want to make sure that the jurist, as he, always a he, is making these choices, is not in a place of emotion and ego. So this is the idea that jurisprudence depends on spirituality. You have to overcome the ego and not get too involved in, I don't like the look of this litigant, and I saw him smoking, and all of those things that can sometimes sway juries, but has to be absolutely as neutral as possible, and that's a spiritual, not a legal exercise. So very often we find that the really great legal thinkers in Islam have been those who have been quite actively involved in tazkiyah, spirituality of various kinds, and the respect that later generations show for their judgment is partly a respect for their own inner cultivation that has enabled them to be as objective and also as merciful as possible. So there is Ebussuud's father, ensconced in his nice new tekke in Istanbul, and this is also very characteristic of the Ottoman state, that the sultans like to have company. The loneliness of power is a burden. And they associate not just with jurists, but very often with Sufis as well. And this is a consistent feature of the Ottoman state right up to Shaykh Abdal Hakim in 19th century Istanbul, who was maybe the closest of the ulama to Sultan Abdul Hamid, Shadhili Sheikh from Damascus, having a spiritual mentor, a palace chaplain, if you like, was just part of the way in which things worked. And this goes right back to the foundation of the dynasty. And also the fact that these miracle workers, charismatic leaders, enjoy enormous support amongst the masses. The guy selling kebabs on the street corner in Sultan Ahmed might really love the Mufti, but he's not really going to get directly involved in the reasons why the Mufti is such a great Mufti. But a miracle worker, a saint, a Sufi, somebody who's living a life of poverty and helping the poor, curing people, is more interesting to the masses. And therefore one important way for the ruler in his very kind of empyrean, detached palace world of remaining in touch with the masses is through these sort of purveyors of popular charisma. So Sultan Orhan, in many ways the founder of the dynasty, spent a lot of time with these people, the famous Geyikli Baba, the kind of almost kind of animistic age of ancient Turkish tasawwuf. He's the man with the deers, because famously he used to hang out with deer in the forest. He was a forest dweller, and promised the Sultan that he's never going to leave his forest and come to the palace. And the only time when he obeys the sultanic decree is when he actually takes an enormous tree from his forest, carries it on his back, and plants it in the courtyard of the Sultan's palace and say, now I think it's all right for me to spend some time here, but you should really come to the woods if you want to be my disciple. There's a big thing between trees, spirituality, and sultanic authority that is persistent in Ottoman history, that goes back to the very early Ottoman period when they're kind of nomads and they haven't really got a city yet. So that becomes characteristic. The Geyikli Baba refuses the Sultan's request to live in his nice palace, says he prefers his forest, but if the Sultan chooses, he can build him a place for his disciples to live out in the forest, the tekke. And so state patronage of dervish lodges and monasteries, again, is one of the ways in which the elite maintain sort of a patronage of and connection with popular piety. And this certainly continued in the time of Bayezid with the relationship with Ebussuud's father. Bayezid is one of the best loved sultans. I mean, many of them, they weren't the kind of guys who you'd want to marry your daughter particularly. They were kind of rough, isolated, exercised an absolute power in a difficult age and geography. Bayezid was known for justice, or a concern for the less advantaged sectors of his population, and took seriously the Ottoman claim to be alim pena, refuge of the world. So it's Bayezid who writes the famous letter to the Jews of Spain. 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, disaster is coming not just to the Moors of Spain, but also to the Jews, who writes to them inviting them to come to his well-protected domains. And many of them come. Of course, this helps to repopulate Istanbul, and great and sober traders, they're an economic asset. But to this day, the Jews of Istanbul still speak a kind of antiquated Spanish. That's their heritage. They go from one end of the Mediterranean to another, seeking Muslim protection. So he's the one who did that. He even sent the Ottoman Navy, that was quite a journey at the time, to Spain in order to get to the places where Muslims and Jews are being expelled. And he sends the famous Ottoman Admiral Kemal Reis in his flagship, the Göker, which is said to have been the biggest ship in the world at the time, outside China, which carried 700 men, in order to go to these coastal areas of Spain where, almost on the beaches, the Jews and the Muslims are congregating, those who refuse to accept baptism, and take them off to the well-protected domains. The navy is important for the Ottoman Empire because if you think about the geography, it's almost like the Roman Empire again, where the center of things is a sea, the Middle Sea. And the remainders of the Crusaders, the Knights of St. John, who have installed themselves in the island of Rhodes, are a real headache because they're holy warriors, crusaders, and one of the big things they do is to intercept the ships that are taking people on the Hajj. And one of the main achievements of Suleiman's reign is that he reduces the island of Rhodes and chucks out the Knights of St. John. But in a kind of chivalric moment, he's so impressed by their courage in defending their fortress that he doesn't just sort of imprison them, sell them into slavery, but allows them to leave. Some of his advisors say, these people are devils, don't let them leave. But he allows them to leave, and they go to Malta, and they're still there. The Knights of St. John are sovereign order, and they caused trouble for the Ottomans later on, and they were raiding for slaves in North Africa. Anyway, so the navy is also an important part of the Ottoman world. So Bayezid, eldest son of Mehmed the Conqueror, the Adli, is somebody who is patronizing these families. But it's a difficult time because Bayezid has a brother, Jem Sultan, who also wants to be sultan and flees and takes refuge with the Pope, of all people. He goes to Rome, and the Pope kind of imprisons him. And you can see the Castel Sant'Angelo, which is the Pope's castle, which is next to the tie boats, still there. And that's where Jem Sultan lives for years and years, with his wives and his pages and his own scholar, and it's kind of a little Ottoman world in the center of Rome. And the Pope kind of holds him prisoner and forces the Ottomans to pay an enormous sum of money just for keeping him there. Otherwise he'll let him go and there'll be a civil war in Anatolia. This is one of the big traumatic moments of the Ottoman dynasty. Jem Sultan goes to France as well. There's a recent book about him, a rather tragic figure who writes some rather good poetry. So these are troubled times, but also a golden age in many ways. And then we find Ebussuud is working his way up as a kind of very junior scholar in his teens, very proficient. He's become a Hafiz at a very early age, and with his father he has worked on the basic text of Hanafi fiqh, but he gets his first break when he becomes a mudarris, which is the chief teacher, because a madrasa tended to be the kind of possession of a given teacher. There would be subordinate scholars, but to be the mudarris was to be the lead scholar with a daily salary of a certain number of silver coins, akches. So you'd have a 10 akche madrasa was a kind of basic one, a 20 akche madrasa was a bit better, and so forth. So he's appointed to this little one. Now let me see if I can read some of this Ottoman text, just because it's a dead language. So let's see if we can revive it. Müderris köyünde pertev indazi alimi vücudi ve şam'i nuri efşaiyi be celsi şuhudi olunmuştur idi evaili halde fe pederi, etc. So what Ata'i is saying is that he becomes, first of all, a shining light, a candle lit in the madrasa of this village near Istanbul, where the light of his knowledge amongst all present was a wonder, even though he was just still in the shade of his own father and at the beginning of his road. Yes. Sometimes you have to turn several pages before you come to the verb in these old Ottoman texts. Yeah. Well, the point is that he's made his first break, his teaching in this little village near Istanbul, and he is persisting in this until another disturbing event in the life of the empire takes place in the year 1512, when Bayezid leaves the throne, abdicates. It's a little bit unclear what's happened. Maybe he's been forced to resign by his son. And now the empire is in the very different hands of Sultan Selim I. So Bayezid is Adli, the just, Selim is Yavuz, the grim. And he is the paradigmatic Ottoman obsessive conqueror. During his 8 years, he increases the landmass of the empire by 70%. He's the one who conquers the Arab world. He's the one who, at the Battle of Chaldiran, defeats the extreme Walat Shia of Iran and secures eastern Anatolia. He spends his life in the saddle. It's even said that he dies as a result of contracting a disease from a fungus that is produced in saddle leather. And it kind of does him to death. And his great Mufti is Kemal Pashazadeh, and they have a very close relationship. And Kemal Pashazadeh, in many ways, is the immediate predecessor of Ebussuud in terms of the kind of things that he writes about, the way in which he uses this post of Shaykh al-Islam in order to guide the Sultan, very irascible in many ways, towards a more correct understanding of the sharia. It's a difficult kind of post. In 1514, Muhyiddin Effendi, Ebussuud's father, dies. And in 1516, Muayyid-Zadeh, who is his first kind of scholarly colleague and the one who's helped him to get this patronage, dies. So he's now in his mid-20s. And it's really not clear if Bayezid is gone and his difficult son is now in charge, and his father's gone and his patron is gone, where is he going to go next? This is not a world where you can just send in your CV and nobody knows you and it looks good, you're invited for an interview and up you go. It's basically done through patronage, who you know. And the Ottomans would say that's a better system because you're being recommended by people who have a lot of experience and can tell that you will do the job. In reality, a lot of nepotism and the promotion of incompetence, and even the history of some of the later Shaykh al-Islams is the appointment of people who, from an academic and even a moral point of view, were not necessarily top drawer. So he's in this little village, and Kemal Pashazadeh, who knows him, who's the Shaykh al-Islam, offers him another madrasa, but it's at 25 silver coins a day, not 30 silver coins a day. And he says no, and he perseveres in this little madrasa until he finds his next step up, which is in a place called İnegöl, which is also in the kind of inner Ottoman provinces in Bithynia, another 30 akçe a day job, and he moves there. In 1520, Selim the Grim dies as a result of this weird complaint, and Suleiman the First accedes to the throne, and the son of Ottoman glory has truly risen, and the empire becomes unquestionably the most significant political force in Europe, Africa, and Asia. It's a major political reality in all three of those continents. Ebussuud is introduced to the new sultan, who is already known, and they seem to have had a kind of friendship. It's difficult in these very kind of formal bureaucratic biographies to detect a strong human element. They are analytic and formulaic. But friendship existed then as it does today. And Suleiman had a few close friends. Ibrahim Pasha, his Greek vizier, was certainly one of them. They'd played together as boys in the palace at Edirne. And Ebussuud Effendi is somebody who is also close to the young Suleiman. And that friendship goes on to create one of the most important political sacral partnerships in Islamic history, maybe even more important than the connection between Imam al-Ghazali and Nizam al-Mulk, as we will see. So he starts to get better jobs. He's now in the capital, which is where everybody wants to be. He teaches at the Dawood Pasha Madrasa. He's now on 40 coins a day. He's also friends with Mustafa Pasha, who's the first significant aid to the new Suleiman, who gives him a madrasa. And then he gets his key step when he moves to the royal madrasa, the Sultaniya madrasa in Bursa. Bursa is important. It used to be the Ottoman capital before Edirne. Many of the royal princes and princesses are buried there, and it's a very important indication that you're part of the establishment. We do detect in the words of his contemporaries, some sense of his impressiveness as a scholar, that he was known for his quietness and for the stillness of his demeanour. He would be hugely dignified and hieratic and would only speak when was absolutely necessary, never interrupted anybody, and never spoke without considering his words in advance. So then, if we can go back to this Altay Effendi. 34 tarihinde Abdülatif Efendi yerini medarisi semandan canibi şarkiyede vakı müfti müderrisisi demekle maruf medrese manende sadaf-ı gevher-i şehvar zat-ı âli tayyarlar ile şeref buldu. Ol bukai celilede 5 sene kamil cem-i fadil ve şeref fezaili eyleyüp. So this is the key moment where he gets one of the most desirable professorships in the greatest madrasa in the empire. Mehmed the Conqueror, as I said, wanted to make his new capital an intellectual centre and created what was a kind of university, the 8 colleges, Sahni Saman, around his imperial mosque in Fatih in Istanbul. And if you go there, you can still see that the buildings are intact, even though during the Ataturk era they were converted into nightclubs and so forth. A friend of mine went to one of the nightclubs in one of these madrasas and said, in the dome, somebody had painted, Allah yok, Muhammad yok. There's no God, there's no Muhammad, which is not quite how Islam works according to a Salafi perspective. But anyway, in the nightclub, when you were drunk, you could look up and see this in a place that had been for centuries, a place for sacred learning. Under the current order in Turkey, some of those properties are being restituted for sacred purposes, but the Sahn was really in the Sunni world the place to be. Greater colleges than anywhere in the Arab world or in North India, and very much as an imperial foundation, well endowed, with lots of revenues coming in from awqaf, mainly in the Balkans, to sustain them and to make sure the libraries were good, everything was cleaned, the students were well cared for, and it was kind of the Cambridge of the Ottoman Empire. So of these 8 colleges, he is appointed to be the director of the Mufti's College. And as the text says, he stays there for 5 years, where his sun rises brighter. Now, as you'll recall, what we said about the mode of preferment in the Ottoman judiciary is that you would be in the academic world, dealing with students, mastering the texts, hopefully writing your own commentaries on the text, and by an informal process of peer review, either people would use those commentaries or they wouldn't. And then there would be the key step, not obligatory, but people aspired to it, where you would leave the madrasa and become a judge. And if you were in a top madrasa, you would get a very significant judgeship. And you became a judge before you became Mufti. This was the way they organized things. So, Suleiman, after he spent 5 years in the college at the Fatih, appoints him to be the Rumeli Kazaskar, in other words, the chief military judge of Rumelia, of the European provinces, which is the second highest religious post in the entire empire. Let's see if we can look at the original here. Kırktırk Rabi'il evvelde Muhyiddin Effendi yerine Sadr-ül Alamai Rum ve nail gayetil gayet murun oldular. 8 seneden ziyaret kevkebi bahti ve ikbalları furuzeyada olup işai eşe'i adl, etc. For these years, the rays of the twinkling glory of his knowledge shone out over the position of being the distinguished chief judge of the ever victorious army of Rumelia, etc. He's in this post, and by this time just about everybody in the empire would have heard of him and would have respected him. And he's in this post, as he says, for 8 years, which is a fairly long period. Very often Ottoman judicial appointments didn't last very long, partly because it was a matter of changing political alignments, patronage, people being sacked, sometimes for no good reason. It was never very stable. It was dependent entirely on the whim of the Sultan and whoever was whispering in the Sultan's ears. But we find that during this time, and I guess this is where the leadership qualities of a bureaucrat become evident, he brings about some important and enduring administrative reforms. Doesn't sound very exciting. A lot of committee work. And he finds that the records for the Rumelian army are not impressive, and he also finds that the systems by which the appointment to key mudarris positions and qadis is a little bit, shall we say, inconsistent. The records aren't there, the procedures are not standardized. How long should be the default period of a judge? What should be the staffing in a judgeship of a court of a particular size? How many candidates could be allowed to be considered to apply for a particular judgeship? So the Ottomans later impose, as a result of his reforms, a cap on the number of people who can apply for a particular position. They also lay it down that a judge should not be in post in a particular city for more than 7 years. These seem to be Ebussuud's innovations, that you had to get somebody new, fresh blood, after 7 years. And then, 1545, he reaches the summit of the entire system and he becomes Shaykh al-Islam as a result of his effectiveness in organizing the army of Europe. You have to remember this, again, is a time of campaigns, which means that he's with the army for a lot of the time. So Sultan Suleiman is riding off to Hungary. Buda becomes the great Islamic city of Budim, with its Orta Hisar, with its madrasas. And if you go to Budapest, you can still get some sense of what it was like as a Muslim city. Gulbaba, the great Bektashi saint of Budapest, is still there. The turbe is still maintained. It somehow survived the violence of the Inquisition, which the Habsburgs brought in when in, whatever it was, 1686 or something, the city was lost to the Dar al-Islam and the population was massacred. But it was an important Ottoman city for a while in Majaristan, in Ottoman Hungary. But this involved obviously a lot of legal issues. The army is marching through different kinds of provinces, soldiers misbehave, what to do with camp followers, what to do with soldiers who are gambling with dice, what to do with people who've stolen from legitimate subjects of the Sultan. There's a lot of judicial issues that arise, and it's important because the Ottomans like to maintain absolute discipline in their army. Venetian and Genoese travellers who observed the Ottoman armies that marched through Europe were amazed by the kind of machine-like precision with which camp would be struck every morning. They'd march until noon. The orderliness of it, the lack of drunkenness, the fact that the Sultan would always punish anybody who'd been stealing from Christian or Muslim villages. It was rigorous, almost a monastic procedure. But 3 months marching, and then a campaigning season, and then marching back again. And if you want to know why the Ottomans didn't continue, Europe in the grip of mad religious wars at the time, the Reformation, why they didn't capture Vienna and move on. And if you go to St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, they still have the Turkish cannonballs stuck in the roof of the cathedral. They were very close. They were in Central Europe, not Eastern Europe any longer. Basically, it seems to be because the campaigning season was so short. You need to get your enormous army of 100,000 men with camels and huge artillery all the way to the gates of Vienna, and then you'd have to get back again before winter set in. So the campaigning season, as they moved into Europe, just got shorter and shorter until the conquests became more and more difficult. But if they'd captured Vienna and broken through into Germany, which was completely prostrate because of the wars of religion between the Lutherans and the Catholics, and European history would have been different. But in any case, that was not the divine decree. But this role as the orderer of the judicial processes of the army of Europe impressed Suleiman, so he makes him Shaykh al-Islam. This is a post which, as I mentioned earlier, has kind of floated beyond the Muslim memory. We don't think of Sunni Islam as having a kind of grand mufti of everywhere. Everything has become shattered into Mufti of Egypt and the Mufti of Syria and the Mufti of wherever. Australia has a Mufti, and it's kind of vague and unclear as to the authority of these people and their role. That's a kind of pale, often disappointing shadow of what the Ottomans were trying to do. So who is the Shaykh al-Islam, and what was his job? It's not a judge's position, it's a mufti's position. In other words, he is dealing with all of the questions that people want to raise to the highest possible level in the judiciary. And there's a huge number of questions, a whole blizzard of people writing in fatwas. So, according to one of his contemporaries, Ebussuud, as mufti for decades, after the sabah namaz, the morning prayer, would sit down and the fatwa questions would come to him, and he would dispatch them very efficiently until he'd finished sometime around the afternoon prayer, every day. Sometimes there would be over 1,000 fatwas every day, and each one a major religious legal responsibility. Despite their numerosity, they were each very important to their individual supplicants. Am I divorced from my wife? Can I take this patch of land that nobody's using? I've been paid with bad coin. What remedy do I have? You can imagine a lot of things, but not as judge, but as mufti. In other words, his fatwas don't have any executive authority. They're just fatwas. But because of his closeness to the Sultan and the fact that his fatwas are so respected by the qadis, these were important legal documents. And we still have some of them, even though kind of they were consigned to waste paper shortly after being used. But some scholars did kind of keep them because of Ebussuud's status and kind of kept them in scrapbooks, and we still have some of those. Basically, an Ottoman fatwa was presented in a fairly standardized form. From the 15th century right up to the 20th century, a very long, thin piece of paper. At the top, Huwa, he, the divine name, and then a blank space, which they call the space of respect, and then not the tughra, the sultanic kind of cipher, but instead a formula asking for God's support, and then the question, and then the Mufti's answer. His signature had to be there, and then afterwards, ahqarul wara, something like that, the lowest of humanity, which is how the Mufti would describe himself. And they tend to be in this format. Now, because there's so many of them, Ebussuud, again with his administrative gifts, wants to reduce the amount of work that he has to do working out people's handwriting or exactly what somebody is asking, or it's in bad Turkish or whatever. So he builds up the civil service in the fatwa office and appoints a chief fatwa clerk, Fetva Emini, who is responsible for making sure that when these documents hit the Mufti's in-tray, they're in a format that enables them to be turned around easily. So the question is carefully formulated, and it's always anonymous. It's not, I'm Mustafa and my wife is smoking, what right do I have to deal with her, and her father is on her side. Not that kind of thing, but instead formulaic. So Zayd and Hind have this problem. What is the opinion of the Hanafi jurists on this? It's always anonymized and standardized, so the Mufti can turn it around quickly. Whether he actually wrote all of them or whether his staff were kind of just asking him to sign something because the same question has arisen many times, we don't know, but it is clear that many of them he did deal with himself. And in some cases, for instance, there's a famous one where the fatwa question comes in the form of a Persian poem, and Ebussuud takes time out to write his response in the form of another Persian poem. So you get that kind of phenomenon, and he is clearly aware of his responsibilities in this. He doesn't have time in this little piece of paper to give you all of the Quranic verses and the hadith. That's not really what a mufti does. It's not a detailed tract of ijtihad. It's just saying, jaiz or olor or olmaz, this is legitimate, this is not legitimate, this is impossible. Simple answers like that, and maybe he'll give an indication of where this is found in one of the standard Hanafi fatwa texts. So the generation of fatwas is important, particularly in the Hanafi legal tradition. It's one of the great genres of Hanafi legal production. They have their commentaries like Quduri, and then the commentaries on Quduri and Marghinani produces his own commentary on his own explanation of Quduri, and it kind of accumulates in crusts with different commentaries and glosses and super glosses over the years. And Ebussuud also writes in that genre. But another important genre of Hanafi fiqh writing is the Risala, which is a jurist writing about a particular question. So Ebussuud deals with the question of wiping over boots to prepare for prayer, which if you're in the army, marching through the snow in Croatia or something, is an important issue. So particular issues are dealt with sometimes in this Risala genre. But the collection of fatwas is also really important and goes back in the Hanafi tradition, particularly to the fatwas of Qadi Khan, which is still used, which is, I think, a 12th century Central Asian collection of fatwas. And then for the Ottomans, an important fatwa collection was called the Bazaziyya, which is a mid-15th century collection of updated Hanafi fatwas written by somebody called Ibn Bazzaz, who was from Crimea. Ottoman Empire was big. Crimea is still independent at that time under the Giray dynasty, but it's a Muslim country. And the Fatawi Bazaziyya continue to be an important source of fatwas for the Hanafi Ottomans. But Ebussuud, even though he doesn't himself put his fatwas together in a single book, they're so respected, not just because of his charisma, but because they just seem to be intuitively right. They are collected subsequently and even referred to today in modern Turkey. What was Ebussuud's view of Sufi dancing or something? There it is. So these become really important. He's not a Chief Justice or an Attorney General in that sense. He is offering his view as to what is legally correct. And these documents then go to the Sultan or go to the army heads should this janissary be lashed for stealing a goat or something? It's not Mufti to put that into practice, but at least the army officer, military police will know what to do. They are the executive arm. So he is a great administrative reformer and is able to turn around all of these questions every day. Normally they are in Turkish, even though most of the ulama are writing in Arabic. And the fact that they're in fairly straightforward Turkish means that they become well known amongst the population, which is largely Turkish speaking. Now, I mentioned that even though he's head of the religious hierarchy, he doesn't have any kind of authority. He's not like the Pope, who is a temporal prince, as well as being the head of the Catholic Church and has his own domains and is a sovereign ruler and a crown. The Shaykh al-Islam is never like that. The executive, where is the executive in Islamic law? This is, for the Hanafis in particular, an interesting question. So on the one hand, we tend to think of the Ottoman state as sort of oriental despotism. There is the Sultan with his pashas and his word is law and everybody else is quaking in their boots. In reality, in Hanafi law, it can't be like that. And this is perhaps the most interesting aspect of what Ebussuud is trying to do with the sharia. The Turks are inheriting Persian and also ancient Turkish traditions of kingship. They have a whole list of titles, master of the two seas, blah, blah, servant of the two holy cities. Khakan, which is an ancient Turkish title, so they inherit the mantle of ancient Central Asian Turkish nomadic chiefs. But they're also Caesar, because they're in Constantinople, so they're heirs to the Roman Empire, which the Europeans never accept, but they think is pretty obvious. The Romans were Christians, so why can't Muslims be Caesars as well as Christians? And they inherit the Persian traditions of statecraft that they've inherited through the Seljuk tradition in Anatolia, with Seljuk roots, administratively, Islamically, basically being in the Iranian plateau. So they're inheriting all of these different things, but even though many of those kingly and sultanic traditions are authoritarian, particularly those rooted in Roman and Persian precedents, the Sharia actually insists on something strangely different. And this is one of the problems that the Ottomans are always contending with. On the one hand, there is the master of the two seas in his amazing palace, and the rulers of Europe tremble at his name. On the other hand, if you look in the Hanafi books of fiqh, what power does he have? And it turns out not a lot. And this becomes one of the kind of defining tensions of the Ottoman polity, because for the Hanafi consensus, a ruler only does four things. Firstly, he establishes the legitimacy of the Friday and the Eid prayers. In Islam, that's a sultanic government phenomenon. If the Sultan hasn't authorized the Friday prayer in a particular place, then people just pray Zuhr. And he can retrospectively acknowledge the validity of a Friday prayer afterwards, but it really depends on him. Where you say your Eid prayer, you can't just go out to some field and do it. It has to be a place designated by the Sultan. And the Sultan's name is mentioned as an important part of the khutbah. That's the position in the traditional Sunni madhabs. And ideally, the ruler himself is leading the Friday prayer. Well, that's not happened for a very long time. If you go to Mecca now, you'll see this enormous palace, and the king, when he's in Mecca, supposedly is on the top balcony and following the Jama'ah for Friday prayers. The old days, even King Fahd used to attend the prayer in the haram, but now they're in this kind of air-conditioned place far away. But properly speaking, the ruler should be leading the Friday prayers and giving the khutbah with a sword. That's the tradition. And even today you see in the mosques in the Ottoman tradition, There's a lot of kind of political symbolism. The names of the first four caliphs will almost invariably be there. There'll be a flag on the minbar, which is the caliphal sultanic Ottoman crescent and star. It's very much a government expression. And that's one of the four functions, one of the four things that the ruler can and must do. Function number 2 of a Muslim ruler is to implement the hudud. In other words, the 5, sometimes 6 canonical non-negotiable punishments, which are Quranic. So that's the punishment for zina, for adultery, for qadh, which is slanderous accusations of adultery, consumption of wine, and by extension other narcotics, theft, sariqa, and hiraba, which is sort of aggregated highway robbery. That it is for the sultan to monitor, to police, and to punish. Now, in Ebussuud's Fatwas, we find that by this time the Hanafi tradition had acknowledged that the punishment for adultery was just a kind of rhetorical device that was never put into practice, because you need 4 upright male eyewitnesses to everything, and in the real world that doesn't happen a whole lot, and therefore you find that the stoning punishment basically is not actualized in the Ottoman realms, or generally in pre-modern Islamic history, not for modern liberalizing reasons, but because technically it's a very odd kind of thing. The rules for evidence are not like those required in anything else in sharia. Nowadays, of course, some town in northern Nigeria implements sharia, and the next day they found some poor woman stoned to death, but not in pre-modern Islamic times. This was regarded as a kind of statement about the enormity of violating marriage ties. It's a very, from a Western perspective, it's a very odd kind of law. If it's there and it's fierce, but it's obviously not really designed to be done. And it seems anomalous. But the Ottomans recognized this. And also, interestingly, for sariqa, theft, the cutting of the hand, again, not for sentimental reasons, the Ottomans could be brutal when they wanted, that this was generally not applied because of the very difficult evidentiary rules that Hanafi fiqh requires. It has to be deliberately taken out of somebody else's hayyiz, their own possession, which is defined in a very strange way and a very absolute way. According to certain conditions, you have to have a confession or you have to have witnesses. In practice, it's been very difficult to implement that. I remember when I was living in Saudi Arabia, everybody was grumbling about the Saudi laws about theft, because the Qadi's interpretation was that if you left something in your car and somebody broke into your car and stole it, that wasn't theft, because it was visible, therefore it was in a public space and wasn't taken from your own property. And everybody thinks this is completely crazy. But it's known amongst those who apply traditional texts of fiqh that this is a difficult and anomalous thing to put into practice. So what Ebussuud does is to redefine what we would call theft as a different sharia category of sort of usurpation or unlawful appropriation. In other words, it's still theft as we would understand it, but it doesn't carry the had punishment. It carries a ta'zir penalty, which is discretionary according to the interpretation of the judge. So generally in the Ottoman Empire, if you stole somebody's donkey, you would be flogged or imprisoned. So that's another interesting aspect of the ruler's authority. These 5 penalties are the only area in which the ruler really has executive authority, but 2 of them in practice turn out not to be implemented. But there's 2 others. The ruler has the responsibility for the collection, the supervision and the disbursement of the zakat. Again, because of the difficulties of doing that, Muslim rulers have generally not involved themselves in that. Zakat has been a private matter, or something at best locally administered, or determined by families or by tribes. But the Ottomans never had a central authority, despite the enormousness of their bureaucracy, which tried to look after and regulate zakat. Other taxes, land taxes and things, sometimes they did, but not for zakat. And the fourth was another tax or a levy on booty acquired through conquest, which is important in the Ottoman context, which is called the khums. In other words, of everything which is taken on the field of battle, a fifth has to go to the government, to the sultan. So that's another of the function of the rulers. But so what we get, what Abu Sa'ud and Suleiman, as they talk together, Suleiman is shadow of God on earth, the most powerful man in the world. His daughter's the richest woman in the world. They're extraordinary. And they're trying to figure out what is the religious basis for what I'm doing. Found themselves up against the Hanafi tradition, which is actually the ruler is kind of a figurehead and his name is in the khutbah and he can tell you where to do the Eid prayer and maybe he'll help you with your zakat, but in practice he never does that. And it's a very odd model. Islamic law seems to envisage a radically decentralized vision of society. There has to be a ruler. This is not anarchism. And the ruler carries the banner of the Prophet and leads the army into battle. But even the jihad is considered in the Hanafi fiqh not to be the ruler's prerogative, but a collective prerogative of the believers to be decided upon amongst themselves. Now that's very strange in the context of a modern or a pre-modern polity. The ruler can declare war, but it's kind of only because the masses have endorsed or will endorse what he's doing. And usually that happens through the Mufti. The Mufti tells the Sultan that it's legitimate to declare war on the Russians or whatever. And that's taken to be the Sharia's view, which is taken to be what the masses want. But it's not a unilateral decision from the top at all. So, a very odd image of imperial politics, totally unlike, say, the Habsburgs, totally unlike the ancient Romans, unlike the Byzantines, unlike the modern nation state, which likes to control everything. Irony of our modern lives is that we talk about freedom and rights, but in reality, so much of our life is regulated by government. We have a national curriculum. Ottomans never had anything like that. A ministry of health. Ottomans never had anything like that. So the Ottoman realms tend to present the spectacle of a radically decentered, sometimes even centrifugal space, symbolically, emblematically, religiously united by the person of the Sultan, but in reality, people's lives were very local. In most cases, the Qadi would be, in a small town, would be a local appointment. The imam of the mosque, the headman of the village, the head of the tribe, the head of the religious community, because it wasn't just Muslims, of course, there were also formally constituted Armenian, Orthodox and Jewish communities, millets, in the Ottoman Empire, with a very high degree of autonomy that would be impossible in the context of a modern liberal democracy. They hyperventilate about sharia tribunals, even though they don't really clash with British law, which is still sovereign. But we get very worried about that. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan doesn't get involved in lawmaking and doesn't get involved in the making of the sharia either. This is something that is worth bearing this in mind, which modern Muslims have generally forgotten. So in Pakistan, for instance, law comes from the government. There's a council for Islamic ideology that is supposed to make sure that it's all religiously correct. But in reality, the laws are decided upon by members of the parliament who are appointed by universal suffrage. So in reality, that means that the ideology of the state, which is supposed to be a religious ideology, and their fatwa choices and what they do with minorities and blasphemy and so forth, is really not decided by the decentralized sharia, but is decided by the electorate. And that's not the sharia model. But the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, that cannot work well. It cannot work well, and it does not work well. And many of the current instabilities in the Islamic world come from the fact that Muslims have unconsciously and in a reactively westernized way tried to adopt the Western image of the centralized nation state and to turn it into the Islamic state with an Islamic ideology. That's not the Ottoman model, is not the Islamic model at all, which is a radically decentered system that gives a lot of authority to local communities, neighborhoods, religious groups, guilds, tariqas. It's a kind of tapestry of difference. And Catherine Burke, in her book, The Empire of Difference, talks about the Ottoman Empire and the paradox of this apparently unified state with the Sultan as the shadow of God on earth. But in reality, most people never engage with the government ever. Even if they're paying taxes, they're paying it to the local bishop or someone who collects it on behalf of the pasha, and then it goes up to the imperial bureaucracy. And we need to remember this in our time of Islamic states. That's not the Islamic model. In any case, back to Ebussuud, he's telling the Sultan, actually he's only allowed to do 4 things. Otherwise, the culture just expects him to get on with his probably quite hedonistic lifestyle in the palace and not bother people with their daily lives. Society is self-regulating. It looks like some versions of anarcho-syndicalism in many ways. If you read Kropotkin, you'll find an image of the state which is a little bit similar. It's not completely anarchist. There's still a ruler. There has to be the possibility of collective self-defense, some form of minimal regulation, but it is more anarchistic than our stereotype of Oriental despotism. So one of the key things that the Sultan does do in the Ottoman context that is not really valid in the Hanafi vision is to issue practical laws or to confirm laws that are there in provinces before they've been added to the empire. So one of the oddities of the Ottoman Empire is that you have 2 legal systems. There's the shariat, but there's also something called qanun. The shariat is there in the collections of fatwas and in Quduri and Marghinani and the Bazazia, but there's these qanunnames, books of laws, which exist in order to regulate certain practical details that you won't find in the rather idealizing Hanafi tradition. What do you really do in cases of theft, for instance? You have to have laws about property. What do you do in questions of land tenure, disputes over irrigation, disputes over taxing beehives? There's a whole lot of stuff necessarily present in the empire, which is not that in the Hanafi tradition, and which has to be extrapolated either through a kind of utilitarian ijtihad, but generally is regulated by the practice of the ruler in these qanuns. And the Ottomans are inheriting different qanuns. Again, it's very regionally specific. So the rules that they have for taxing water mills in Bosnia are a bit different to those they have, say, in southern Anatolia or in Egypt. Over the years, as they issue more of these rescripts, they tend to become a little bit homogenized, but generally the empire is a patchwork of different kinds of localized laws, which mirrors in many ways the decentralized nature of sharia administration. But this looks like a problem to a lot of the ulama. God's law alone is sovereign. What are all these qanuns? That's not even a proper Arabic word. Do we not need to reduce and do away with these extra judicial things, even though in practice much of the empire is regulated by them? Army regulations, and who taxes the guilds, and who controls river crossings, and who maintains security at ports. You need rules for those things. So Ebussuud is troubled by this. And one of the things, in fact the thing he's most remembered for amongst later Ottoman scholars, is that he irons out the disparities between qanun and sharia. And this is one reason why Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent has as his epithet. Remember, Bayezid is the just and Selim is the grim. Suleiman is the lawgiver, qanuni, a bit like Justinian, the lawgiver. well, how does that happen if he's only got these four little functions? He's not allowed to issue laws, not allowed to do anything really. Let him go back to his dancing girls or whatever he spends his time on, but let him not get involved in important things in the state like law. So they're obviously talking about this, and in his fatwas you find that Ebussuud very often, while he recognizes the ongoing authority of Qanun, irons out certain things that are not Sharia compliant, and in other cases redefines things in ways that make sense to the Sharia. So we've already seen how he deals with the fact that the Hanafi law of theft is not being applied by saying, well, we don't call it sariqa, theft, but we call it illegal expropriation, and the judge can impose a non-hudud penalty on that. And he does this pretty systematically. Now the qanuns continue, but the scandal of having a kind of dualistic legal system is significantly diminished. One of the problems that they have in an empire which is essentially agrarian, the basis for the wealth of the empire and the supply of personnel for the armed forces is from the countryside, is that the Ottoman system is not feudal in the sense of having an inserfed peasantry that just can't leave the land, but is that it's not clear who actually owns most of the land. At the lowest level there is the kind of villager and the chiftlik, which is the basic farm. And chiftlik, it means like a yoke between two oxen. In other words, the area of land owned by a peasant is originally defined as the area which you can plough in a single day. That makes up the basic unit of demarcation in the empire. And villages will be under the authority of a timariot or a local landowner, maybe somebody, some pasha or bey who's been awarded this, or maybe it is owned by a waqf, and the income goes to support one of the big sultanic foundations. But it's not quite clear who is owning this. Is it the peasant who owns it, or is it the landowner who actually has title to it? So can he sell it? He can't really bequeath it, or does the sultan own it? And Hanafi law, Islamic law, doesn't really allow that. You have to have a clear single owner for immovable property. So Ebussuud redefines this in a very fundamental way by saying, actually all of these lands are owned by the state, they're owned by the sultan, and the peasant is a sharecropper who is giving a proportion of his harvest to the landowner in exchange for the right to till the land. And the landowner doesn't own it, but is, as it were, renting it in exchange for the payment of taxes to central government. So this irons out the problem of this old Qanun system that has most of the land in the empire, not all, but most of it, cultivated land at any rate, not clearly owned by anybody. And this is one of the major changes that he makes, and it actually clarifies a lot of things, because if you want to sell the land or divide it, it's clear who it belongs to, and you don't need to engage in protracted negotiations with a lot of people who think that they have a obscurely defined share in it. So this is important. And he also finds that the empire has a lot of localized taxes whose role in Sharia is seen as being problematic. So there's something in Ottoman law called the smoke tax, which is where nomads come down from the mountains and encamp in an area of settled land, and so the state taxes them for the use of that land. It's not really there in the Hanafi fiqh. There's a tax on gypsy dancers, for instance. There's taxes on a lot of things, boatmen at river crossings. And these are enshrined in local law in these qanunnamehs, and Ebussuud tries very hard to redefine these as sharia institutions. And in order to do this, he has to find an authority for doing this. And one of the major transformations that happens in the Ottoman Empire at this time is that the authority, the sovereignty of the Sultan is increased. The old Hanafi rule, which strips the Sultan of just about every governmental authority that we would recognize, is modified by invoking more formally a certain interpretation of classical theories of the caliphate. If you go to the great Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, the masterwork of Ottoman civilization perhaps, it's where the Shaykh al-Islam's office used to be, and madrasas and hospitals, it's a huge complex. Ebussuud is the one who writes the inscription over the main entrance to the Suleymaniye Mosque, which is an exordium of praises for the Sultan, but defines him as the Khalifa. Now, Muslim rulers had often used that in a kind of informal way, even from the beginnings of the Ottoman period. Some of the Seljuks are saying we're Khalifa. It's not a terribly precise term, but in Ebussuud's hands, it becomes not just a kind of nice thing to say about the Sultan, but a formal sharia category that gives the ruler implicitly more rights than those that are conventionally allocated to him in the ideal Hanafi system. So the Khalifa, and again this is part of the inscription in the Suleymaniye, is the interpreter and executor of the law of heaven. I can't remember the original, but that's what it means. Well, even that in caliphal terms is pushing it a little bit, because the Khalifa doesn't have a legislative role. But Ebussuud is working hard to try and ensure that all of these laws that are edicts issued on the authority of government are religiously valid. And he does this through this rather intensified view of who the Khalifa is. So the category that Mawardi and some early theorists of the Khilafah recognize, which is that of siyasa, through executive expediency and authority, the ruler, particularly the caliph, can do certain things, can execute certain rebels, can punish certain people, can introduce certain structures, can build madrasas for a particular purpose, that these become more sort of institutionalized in the Ottoman context as a natural concomitant of the ruler's charisma. So it's a very significant inscription, and you find similar things that he writes at the beginning of some of his books, where he's dedicating his book to Suleiman, and he gives this rather, from a traditional Hanafi perspective, inflated view of the authority of the ruler. So this obviously is complex and runs through much of Ottoman law, but to give you an example of contemporary import, last week we were talking about when we will do marriages in the new Cambridge Mosque and for whom. Who do we say yes to? Who will we say no to? We had 2 marriages during Ramadan, which I didn't know people got married during Ramadan, but we did it. That seems to be halal. But do we always require parental consent? Do we always require that they should bring along the certificate from the registry office? And the Turkish imam who we have, who is a learned person, say in Turkey, to do the nikah, you have to have the official certificate of marriage first, because that protects the couple in cases of dispute. In English law, there's no requirement for legally registered marriage as a precondition for a religious ceremony. Some backbenchers are trying to change that. We shall see how far that gets. But in traditional Islamic law, the state doesn't get involved with things like that. Why is it anything to do with the sultan or the state bureaucracy? It's a private contract between 2 individuals. But in the context of Ebussuud's fatwas, as a mufti, he's seen so many cases where nobody can produce any kind of documentation, maybe a letter, maybe a statement of goods of a dowry or something. It's a notorious area for disputation, that he actually says that you need to have a document from the qadi, who is ultimately a state appointee in this system. Otherwise, you're in a state of legal infraction. So if you've already got your nikahnameh, you need to have that endorsed by the Qadi. Now the Qadi has to endorse it if it's in the appropriate sharia form. You can't say, no, you can't marry her. But it's legally notarized. And that's something relatively new, as far as we can tell, in Islamic history. So the current Turkish rule actually goes back to the time of Suleiman the Magnificent and the bringing together of sultanic and sharia and personal law. So that's one example of the ways in which he does this. And a number of other examples could be cited. I should mention briefly, before I close, some of his major writings. He's famous for his fatwas, but he was quite a distinguished poet, particularly in Arabic. But his major literary work was his Irshad al-Aql al-Salim, which is his tafsir. And he found it very frustrating trying to complete this because he was endlessly interrupted with state business. He found it really hard to get down to his research, as we would say nowadays. All those committees, the Sultan clapping his hands and says, the Mufti will accompany me to Albania or something, and he has to comply. It takes him 30 years to write this tafsir. And the Sultan is really anxious to see it. Suleiman is afraid that one of them is going to die before it's completed. So when he's got to Surah 36 or something, Ebussuud makes a copy of what he's got and sends it with his son-in-law to the palace, just to kind of reassure the Sultan. The Sultan is delighted and gives him a pay rise. Finishes it the next year, which is the year of Suleiman's death, and it circulates amongst the ulama, and although the prestige of its author no doubt drew it to many people's attention, it came to be regarded as one of the three great tafsirs used amongst learned people in the Ottoman Empire, along with Zamakhshari and along with Baydawi. These were the two texts they'd used in the madrasa primarily before that, partly because of their strong kind of Hanafi rationalizing tendencies. But Ebussuud's tafsir is right up there. If you go to bookshops in the Arab world now and you look for books by Ottoman scholars, and partly they just don't know, and partly it's because the texts are in Turkish, but generally the two books you'll find, or maybe the three books you'll find, will be Haji Khalifa's book, on the different disciplines. You will find Tashka Pirzade's book, which I referred to, Miftah al-Sa'ada, and you will find the tafsir of Ebussuud, very, very reputed. So he completes this. He writes a few short fiqh books. He writes, as I said, quite a bit of poetry, but is essentially somebody who works on fatwas and works in a practical way in the judiciary, and does so. He's still off in Macedonia doing cadastral surveys, quite late in his life, but in his, I guess, mid-80s he dies, 1574, and he's buried at Ayyub, which is the quarter of Istanbul where the ashraf and the ulama are traditionally interred. And the place is well known. People can show you where the grave is. He actually endowed a madrasa there, which no longer exists. So all that remains is his quite humble grave. So that's the story that I wish to present today. And it raises questions not just of how you remain pious and sharia-oriented in many ways quite pragmatical imperial bureaucracy, but also reminds us of the surprising decentralization which the Sharia envisages. If you've read Wa'il Halaq's new book, The Impossible State, he talks about the ructions of the modern Muslim world being about the fact that Muslims are now trying to use the Western Enlightenment structure of the nation state with its idea that the government monopolizes violence and law-giving in order to promote the sharia, which is structurally completely allergic to this idea of institutionalizing and governmentalization, and the result is just a totalitarian catastrophe and administrative failure everywhere. It's a worthwhile book, worth looking at. And Halak doesn't look much at Ottoman examples, but you might even see in Ebussuud's reforms, which are trying to make the law of the empire and this huge state consistent, the beginnings of the modern tendency to make fatwa and qada and religious authority something that the state regulates, which is a process that's becoming very intense now, with the kind of state scrutiny of madrasa curriculums and the banning of independent teaching at majalis in the mosques, and the control of the state, not just of the allowing of Friday prayers, but writing every single khutbah, which is increasingly common. They tried to do it in Egypt 2 years ago, and the Azhar let out a howl of protest, and Sisi backed down. But this is the final nail in that coffin in many ways. But the Sharia, in its classical text, is consensually absolutely clear. The state has no right to interfere in these things, and is perceived as at best, small government. Now, how you actually instantiate Sharia in the context of the inescapable structure of the modern nation state, international treaties and so forth, the United Nations, is an interesting question. It's not clear to me how somebody like Ebussuud would have resolved that, but his career does remind us of the inherent difficulty of trying to governmentalize Sharia and charismatic authority in Islam, which is skeptical about central authority and tries to keep its jurisdiction to a minimum. So that was rather a long one, my apologies, but I think he's an interesting guy and an interesting story. And as I said, I've relied very heavily on Colin Imber's book, so if you want to know more about this, I would commend it warmly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.